Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the primary type of firearm mechanism from the colonial period up through the 1820s and 30s, the flintlock. Now, virtually all types of firearms from the beginning of firearm history even through modern day kind of tend to work the same way. They rely on a propellant, typically gunpowder. Now, gunpowder burns very, very fast. And so when that is ignited from a spark or flame of some kind, the expansion of that gas as it burns is going to build up pressure, especially if it's inside of some type of contained area, like the inside of a barrel or inside of a steel or brass casing, like in modern day ammunition. When that gas expands, it's going to try to follow the path of least resistance to move that gas out of the way. In the form of a firearm, that means it is going to try to push the ball or bullet out of the barrel. Now, the flintlock itself is one of the most common ways from about the mid 1650s, when it really becomes kind of the way standard that most people are going to use, up until about the 1830s, when percussion becomes more and more of a thing. But even well into the Civil War, you could definitely still find people using this flintlock type of mechanism. So let's look a little closer at what the flintlock mechanism is. Okay, so here we have a close-up of the flintlock system. So I want to mention that basically all firearms rely on a propellant that pushes a ball or a bullet out the barrel. The difference is the mechanism by which you actually ignite that propellant. So in modern day closed ammunition, like inside of a brass casing, everything is completely inside of that brass. All the powder is inside of it, and it uses a primer. When that primer is struck, it ignites the powder inside that casing, which is inside the barrel. Prior to the flintlock, they also had types like the wheel lock and the matchlock. But into about the mid 1600s, the flintlock becomes kind of the standard. Into really the 1820s and 30s, when percussion kind of started to take over. So how this works is we have the flint right there, and this entire thing is the lock. So flint is a type of stone that breaks off very, very sharp. Flint is the same material that a large percentage of American Indians would be using to make spear and arrow points. So flint, when you knap it, or KNAP, knap flint, you make it into a sharp angle. A sharp angle of flint against a piece of steel or most types of metal that will conduct a spark, that rock against the metal will be a big spark. So this is called the frizzen, this long piece of steel here. Then you have the pan and you have the touch hole. So how this all works is once you have poured powder and your ball down the barrel, it is all seated right in here inside the barrel. You then put a little bit of powder in the pan and close the frizzen. Now, right now it is on half cock. And this is where a phrase comes from, if you've ever heard it, of going off half cocked, or basically not going out prepared. At half cock, most flintlocks will not actually fire. And even if they do, if you do pull the trigger, it is not enough force to actually create a spark. So if you go off with it half cocked, it's not going to actually fire. So to fire it, you will go to full cock. So when you pull the trigger, this hammer is going to come forward and the flint will strike the frizzen and send a shower of sparks into the pan. Now, ideally, what will then happen is the powder in the pan will ignite all the powder inside the barrel and the weapon will fire. But if it does not happen, so if it just sparks and sets off only the powder inside the pan and does not set off the powder in the barrel, that's called a flash in the pan, which is another phrase you may have heard. If that happens, all you do is you have to reload the powder in the pan and keep on firing, or at least keep trying. But you do have to also maintain this. So the flint can snap, it can break, it can chip off, or you have to have it at just the right angle. So if the angle is wrong or it gets messed up in the jaws, then it won't fire. But this is the basic mechanism of the flintlock. And so now we'll look at the loading procedure. So the type of weapon I'm using today, this is a Traditions Kentucky flintlock, and it's made from a kit that I built. So one thing that's definitely different from this from originals is originals were much longer, like even a foot or more longer than this one. And also I'm going to be using modern day powder mixes and measures and that kind of thing. So back in the day, their ramrod was up underneath the musket or rifle itself, and you would load from a powder horn. So this is simply made from a cow horn that is already hollow, and it has a tip to secure the powder inside of that. And you would have a possibles bag, and this is where your shot, your patches would typically be kept, and any tools or anything else that you need to repair the flintlock. Okay, so here we have our powder measure loaded with 60 grains of black powder. Now, the type of powder they would have been using would have been inside of a powder horn. But just like back then, even in modern day, you don't ever want to pour directly from your powder horn into the barrel. Just in case there's a small bit of a spark still in the barrel, then your powder horn becomes a hand grenade. So we use a powder measure. And this one is a modern day brass one, but the ones they would have been using back then would have been made of like a deer antler or a tip of a cow horn. And this way, when you pour the powder in case there is something in the barrel, it's only going to get the powder that's there. All right, so the next step is a lubed patch. Now, I'm using modern day lubed patches that are already pre-done. The patches they would have been using would have been made of thin pieces of cotton or some other material, and the lubricant, the best lubricant was bear grease. But if you didn't have access to that, some guys would just swish it around in their mouth and use their spit. You then put the ball on top. Now, the reason for the patching is you want to have as tight a seal around the ball as you can. And because it's going to be tight, we use a short starter like this one. This is a modern day plastic one. Theirs would have been made of antler or something like that. And so we want to get it started before we use the ramrod. Okay, so now we use the ramrod to seat the ball and the patch on top of the powder. And we want to make sure it is fully seated, so you get a couple taps to bounce it. Now, this is a modern day ramrod, but theirs would have been the rod that is up underneath the bottom of the rifle. Okay, so now we're ready to prime. So back then, the way you would do it is using just a little bit of powder from your powder horn. So I'm going to be using a small primer, just like this one. And if you were using like a land powder musket, or you had actual cartridges, when you ripped it open with your teeth, you just pour a little bit of powder in the pan before you loaded. But for this, for safety, you want to do this last. So we're just going to put a couple little bits there. You want to give it a little tap so that it puts some powder in the flash hole. And now we're ready to fire. All right, so we've got everything loaded, primed, we're ready. And one of the things you should make sure to always have is good eye protection and ear protection. And we're ready to fire. So we'll go to full cock. And there it is. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that. And as always, anytime you're using any kind of firearm, be absolutely as safe as you possibly can. Make sure you have proper ear protection, eye protection, and thank you for watching.